Silas Brackett didn't knock. He never knocked. He rode his horse straight through Tamsin Rowe's garden gate, the one her father had built with his own hands 30 years ago, and let the animal's hooves tear through the winter squash she'd been nursing since September. Then he pulled out a folded document, dropped it in the mud at her feet, and said, without getting off his horse, "Sign it by Friday, or I'll take the water and the land both. Your choice, girl." Girl. She was 34 years old. She had buried her father 6 months ago. She had kept 40 acres alive through a drought that broke 3 other ranchers in the valley. And this man, this stranger who had arrived in Frost Willow with money, lawyers, and a smile like a trap, had just called her girl and ridden away before she could say a single word. She stood in the mud. She looked at the crushed squash. She looked at the document, and she thought, no. Is she tempted? Before we go any further, if you've ever had someone underestimate you, dismiss you, or try to take something that was rightfully yours, this story is going to hit differently. Stay with me all the way to the end, because where this goes will surprise you. If this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. And do me a favor, drop a comment with your city or country. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. And if it moves you, give it a like. It helps more people find it. Now, let me tell you about a hen, a fence, and 2 of the most stubborn people who ever stood on Montana soil. The morning it all began, Ronan Vale was not in a good mood. That wasn't unusual. Ronan wasn't really a good mood kind of man. He was a get up before dawn, fix what's broken, don't complain about it kind of man. His neighbors respected him. His cattle feared him slightly. His friends, and there weren't many, knew better than to bother him before he'd had his coffee. So when he walked out to check the east fence line that October morning and found a hen standing on his side of it, pecking at the frozen ground like she owned the place, his first reaction was not amusement. His second reaction wasn't either. He stood there in the cold, breath clouding in the air, looking at this small brown hen that clearly had not consulted anyone about property rights. She looked up at him once, tilted her head like she was deciding whether he was worth her time, and went back to pecking. "Where'd you come from?" Ronan said. It wasn't really a question. He knew exactly where she'd come from. The Rowe place. The 40 acres that sat east of his land, separated by a fence that had been standing since before either of their families arrived in the valley. The Rowe land, which had been quietly managed by old Thomas Rowe for decades, and which now, since Thomas passed last spring, belonged entirely to his daughter. Ronan had seen her twice. Once at the funeral, where she'd stood dry-eyed and straight-backed while half the valley wept around her. Once at the grain store in September, where she'd argued with Cal Priestley about the weight measurements on a feed delivery until Cal had backed down, adjusted the scale, and given her a 10-cent discount out of pure intimidation. He had not spoken to her either time. He picked up the hen, tucked her under his arm. She objected loudly, and he ignored her, and walked the fence line east until he found the gap. A bottom rail had shifted, probably in the last frost, big enough for a small animal to slip through. He filed that away. He'd fix it this afternoon. He carried the hen to the Rowe property line, set her down on the correct side of the fence, and stood up. Tamsin Rowe was already walking toward him from the barn. She was wearing her father's old coat, too big in the shoulders, sleeves pushed up, and she was carrying a fence post like she'd been planning to do exactly what he'd just been thinking about doing. She stopped about 10 feet from the fence line, looked at the hen, looked at him. "That's mine," she said. "I know," he said. "She get through your fence?" "Rail shifted. I'll fix it this afternoon." A pause. She looked at the hen, who had immediately wandered back toward the gap. "It's on my side of the line," she said. "The fence. The post that shifted. It's on my property." Ronan looked at the fence. He looked at where the post sat. He looked at the general layout of the line, which he had assumed his entire life was exactly where it should be. "It's the boundary line," he said. "It's 4 feet inside my property," she said. "Has been since it was built." He could have said a lot of things. What he said was, "That's a serious claim to make without a survey." "I have the original county records," she said. "My father had them pulled 10 years ago. The fence was built wrong. 4 feet short of where it should be, which means 4 feet of your pasture grass is actually my land. She wasn't angry when she said it. That was the thing that caught him off guard. She wasn't performing outrage or baiting him into a fight. She was just stating a fact, the same way she'd stated that the hen was hers and the rail was on her side. Like the universe had a correct answer, and she already knew what it was. Ronan Vale had been in exactly one serious land dispute in his life, and it had lasted 7 years and cost his father 2 good friendships and a significant portion of his self-respect. He had sworn he would never enter another one. "I'd want to see those records," he said. "Come by Thursday," she said. "I'll have them out." She turned and walked back toward her barn. The hen tried to go through the fence gap again. Ronan caught her, set her back, and made a mental note to fix the rail before he did anything else. He told himself that was the end of it. He was wrong about that. Boom. Thursday came. He went. He looked at the records. Genuine county survey documents, yellowed at the edges but perfectly legible, and spent 45 minutes standing at the row kitchen table arguing that the measurements could be interpreted differently, that the original surveyor's notation was ambiguous, that the creek bend used as a reference point had shifted over the years. Tamsin sat across from him with a cup of coffee she did not offer to share, and dismantled every single argument he made with the calm precision of someone who had anticipated all of them in advance. He left without conceding anything, which felt like a minor victory. He spent the drive back to his ranch, slowly realizing he had not actually won a single point. The next week, her goat got through the fence, different section, rotted post, and wandered into his east pasture. He returned it. She came out to receive it. They stood at the fence line and argued about whose responsibility it was to maintain which section for 25 minutes before Ronan's hired man, Dale, found a reason to be somewhere very far away and stay there. After the goat incident came the creek water dispute. She was using a diversion channel her father had installed, and Ronan maintained it was pulling water that should flow to his lower pasture. She maintained the channel had been there for 15 years, and he had never objected before because he hadn't bothered to notice. He couldn't actually prove she was wrong. The argument lasted 3 weeks across 4 separate conversations at the fence line, 2 of which he had initiated under various pretexts. Dale started timing how long Ronan spent at the east fence. He didn't share his findings because he valued his employment. The settlers in Frost Willow noticed. You couldn't help noticing. Every time Ronan Vale and Tamsin Row ended up near each other, there was a kind of electricity in the air that had nothing to do with weather. Edna Marsh, who ran the post office and therefore knew everything that happened in the valley, told her husband that she'd never seen 2 people so obviously meant for each other spend so much energy pretending they were enemies. Her husband said that was probably why they were doing it. What surprised Ronan most, and he thought about this more than he'd admit to anyone, was the way Tamsin argued. He'd known women who got loud when they were certain they were right, and women who went quiet, and women who cried to end a disagreement, and women who simply walked away. Tamsin did none of those things. She looked directly at him. She said exactly what she meant. When he made a point she couldn't immediately counter, she said, "I'll have to think about that," instead of changing the subject. And she came back 3 days later with a response. It was, he realized somewhere around the 4th or 5th fence line conversation, the most honest he had ever been with another person. Because there was no performance required. She didn't need him to be gentler or more certain or more successful than he was. She just needed him to be accurate. He started fixing problems on his side of the fence more carefully. He told himself it was professional pride. He knew it wasn't, and he argued with himself about it, which was a lot like arguing with Tamsin, except that he lost even faster. In November, at the grain store, she told someone that Ronan Vale was the most aggravating man in the valley. He overheard this. He was inexplicably pleased by it in a way he did not examine too closely. Also in November, old Fletcher Gaines said to Tamsin at the general store, "At this rate, you'll never get married." He said it like a joke, the way older men in small valleys sometimes say things they think are observations. Tamsin didn't miss a beat. She looked straight at Ronan, who happened to be standing near the flour bins pretending to read a label, and she said quietly, "Just loud enough. Only if you ask me." And she walked out. The store was very quiet for a moment. Ronan set down the flower. He looked at the door. He looked at Fletcher, who was staring at him with the expression of a man who has accidentally released something he cannot put back. Ronan walked out after her. She was already halfway down the road, coat pulled tight against the November wind, not looking back. He stood on the porch of the general store and watched her go, and he felt something shift inside his chest, something that had been building since a brown hen crossed a fence line in October and a woman stood in her father's oversized coat and told him he was 4 feet into her property. He didn't go after her. Not that day. But something in him had been decided, even if he didn't have the words for it yet. What he didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that 3 days later, a man named Silas Brackett would ride into Frost Willow with a stack of legal documents and a smile like a blade, and everything in the valley would change. Silas had money. Silas had lawyers in 2 different counties. Silas had a way of making people feel small without raising his voice. And Silas had been watching the valley for months, waiting for exactly the right time. The creek that ran between Ronan's ranch and Tamsin's property. The one that fed both their herds through the summer, that Tamsin's father had depended on for 30 years, that the whole eastern section of Frost Willow relied on when the dry season came. Silas had documents claiming it had never been public water at all. Documents that said he owned it. Documents that, as Tamsin would discover when she finally got her hands on a copy, had been very carefully, very skillfully forged. But that was 3 days away. That was still around the corner, still unseen. Right now, in the fading November afternoon, Ronan Vale stood on the porch of Fletcher's general store and watched a woman walk away down a frozen road. And he thought about fences and property lines and the particular way she had of saying exactly what she meant. He thought about asking the right question. He wasn't ready yet, but he was getting there. And somewhere on the other side of the valley, Silas Brackett was already on his way. Silas Brackett arrived on a Tuesday, which was an ordinary enough day for an extraordinary kind of damage. He didn't come alone. He brought 2 men who wore clean coats and said nothing, and a third man who introduced himself as a land attorney from Billings and smiled too much. They rode into Frost Willow like they'd already decided what the place was worth and found it acceptable, which was its own kind of insult. Ronan heard about it from Dale before noon. "Strangers over at the Marsh place," Dale said, not looking up from the harness he was mending. "Showing papers to anyone who'll stand still long enough. Says he owns the creek." Ronan stopped walking. "Which creek?" "The one that runs between your land and the Rowe place." Dale finally looked up. "Says it was never public water. Says his family acquired the rights back in 1887 and the county lost the records in a fire." "A fire," Ronan repeated. "Convenient," Dale agreed and went back to the harness. Ronan stood in the yard for a moment. The wind came down off the ridge the way it always did in November, cold and purposeful, and he thought about the creek, the sound of it in summer, the way it ran clear over pale stone, the way both his cattle and Tamsin's drank from it without incident because water in a valley like Frost Willow was understood to belong to everyone who needed it. You didn't own a creek. A creek wasn't something you owned. He went inside and got his coat. He didn't go to the Marsh place. He went to the Rowe property first because he had a feeling Tamsin already knew. And he had an even stronger feeling that she was going to do something about it before anyone thought to tell her not to. She was standing in her yard when he arrived, holding a copy of Silas Brackett's document. Her expression was the specific kind of still that meant she was thinking very fast and very hard and had not yet decided what to say out loud. "You've seen it," Ronan said. "He sent a copy over this morning." She didn't look up from the paper. "By messenger. Like a courtesy." "What does it actually say?" She read him 3 sentences from the middle of the document. The language was dense and deliberate, full of references to county codes and water rights statutes and original land grants, and it was constructed in a way that would take a lawyer considerable time to untangle. Ronan understood enough of it to recognize that whoever had written it knew exactly what they were doing. "This is forged," Tamsin said. "Can you prove it?" She looked up at him then. Her jaw was set in that particular way he'd come to recognize, the one that meant she was certain of something and furious that she had to explain why. "The 1887 land grants for this region are in the state archive in Helena. I've seen the index. There's no bracket acquisition anywhere in the Eastern Frost Willow corridor. This document cites a file number that doesn't match the archive system that was in use that year. Ronan stared at her. How do you know what filing system the state archive used in 1887? My father was meticulous, she said, like that explained everything. And maybe it did. We need to get to the marshal, he said. The marshal is in Kalispell until the end of the month. She folded the document precisely, the way you fold something you intend to use as evidence. And even if he were here, Brackett hasn't done anything yet that's technically illegal. He's shown people a document. People are allowed to show documents. People aren't allowed to forge them. You have to prove it's a forgery first. She put the document inside her coat, which takes time, which is exactly what he's counting on. The first Frost Willow settler to sign Brackett's water rights agreement was a man named George Paulson, who had 60 head of cattle and a wife expecting their fourth child and a mortgage that wasn't comfortable even in good years. Ronan heard about it that afternoon and didn't blame George, not exactly, but felt something cold settle in his stomach anyway. By the end of the week, 3 more families had signed. Silas Brackett set up temporary offices in the back room of the saloon, which was either practical or deliberately symbolic depending on how you looked at it. He was unfailingly polite. He bought rounds of drinks. He explained, patiently and repeatedly, that he had no intention of disrupting anyone's operations. He simply needed formal acknowledgement of his family's historic rights, after which water access would continue as normal for anyone who had signed the agreement. What happens to anyone who hasn't signed? Edna Marsh asked him directly, because Edna had never had trouble asking direct questions. Silas smiled. Well, Mrs. Marsh, that would be a matter for the courts to determine. The courts were in Kalispell, same as the marshal. Getting there in November, with weather coming in off the mountains, took the better part of 2 days. Hiring a lawyer cost money most people in Frost Willow didn't have sitting idle. Tamsin stood up at the community meeting 3 days later and said, very clearly, that the document was forged and she could prove it if given enough time to get to Helena and back. She said Silas Brackett had arrived with manufactured paperwork and a strategy built entirely on the assumption that people in a small valley wouldn't have the resources to fight him. She said the filing number on his document was inconsistent with the state archive system in use during the period it claimed to originate from, and she was willing to put that in writing. The room was quiet in that particular way. Rooms get quiet when everyone is thinking about their mortgage and their cattle and their children, and the gap between what's right and what's survivable feels very wide. Silas, who had not been invited to the meeting but had come anyway, listened to all of this with an expression of patient amusement. When Tamsin finished, he said, Miss Rowe, I appreciate your passion, but passion isn't evidence. Neither is a forged document, she said. He tilted his head slightly. Careful with accusations like that. A man's reputation is a serious thing. So is a valley's water supply. There was a murmur through the room, not agreement exactly, more like the sound people make when something uncomfortable has been said too accurately to ignore. Ronan, sitting in the third row, watched Silas Brackett's face during that exchange. The amusement didn't leave it. That was the thing that bothered him most. The man wasn't rattled. He'd expected exactly this, had probably planned for exactly this, and found it about as threatening as a light rain. After the meeting, outside in the cold, Ronan fell into step beside Tamsin on the road back. Neither of them spoke for a while. Their breath made small clouds in the dark air. He's going to block the creek, she said finally. He can't do that legally. He can do it physically. And then, by the time anyone with legal authority gets here to stop him, it'll be December and the cattle will already be in trouble. She walked with her hands in her coat pockets, looking straight ahead. That's the plan, not the paperwork. The paperwork is just to make people feel like there's a process. The plan is to make everyone suffer long enough that signing his agreement looks like relief. Ronan thought about that. He thought about George Paulson's cattle and Edna Marsh's husband who'd had a bad hip since August and couldn't ride to Kalispell even if he'd wanted to, and the 3 families on the south end of the valley who were already thin on winter supplies. What do you want to do? He asked. She stopped walking, turned to look at him. The moonlight was thin and cold and not flattering to anyone, and she looked tired in a way she didn't usually let people see, the skin under her eyes a little dark, her mouth set like she'd been holding it firm for days. I want to go to Helena, she said. Get into the state archive, pull the original 1887 grants, and prove the filing number is fabricated. Then I want to bring that proof back here and hand it to the county marshal and watch Silas Brackett get escorted out of Frost Willow. That's 2 weeks minimum, Ronan said. I know. In November. I know, Ronan. He looked at her. She looked back at him with the specific expression of a woman who has already calculated exactly how impossible something is and has decided to do it anyway. I'll manage things here while you go, he said. She shook her head. You can't. If I'm gone and Brackett moves on the creek, someone needs to be here who won't back down. And the only person in this valley who... She stopped. Say it, he said. The only person in this valley who will absolutely refuse to accommodate him is you, she said, like it cost her something to admit it. Which means you have to stay, and I have to find another way to get evidence without going to Helena. They stood there on the dark road, and the wind came down again off the ridge. And it was, Ronan thought, possibly the first time in their entire acquaintance that she had said something that functioned as a compliment, and they had both just let it sit there without arguing about it. It felt strange, not bad strange. Your father's records, he said. You said he had the original county survey documents. Does he have anything else from the same period, correspondence, old land filings? She was quiet for a moment. He kept everything, she said slowly. There are boxes in the back room I haven't gone through yet. After he died, She didn't finish that sentence. She didn't need to. Then that's where we start, Ronan said. She looked at him for a long moment, and he had the feeling she was deciding something, some internal calculation he wasn't going to be told about. Then she said, Come by tomorrow morning, early. How early? Before coffee, she said, and walked away. He stood there in the cold and thought that before coffee was probably her version of a significant concession. The boxes in Thomas Rowe's back room were a particular kind of chaos that only looked like chaos. Ronan understood this after about an hour of going through them with Tamsin, who could locate any document within 30 seconds once she remembered which box it was in, but couldn't always remember which box that was. Her father had organized everything by some system that lived entirely in his own head and had died with him. They worked through the morning and into the afternoon. Tamsin found a box of correspondence from the 1890s that included several letters from the county land office, 2 of which referenced water rights surveys along the eastern corridor. Ronan found a packet of receipts from a surveying company that had done work in the valley in 1889, 2 years after the date on Brackett's document. Look at this, Tamsin said, laying a letter flat on the table. It was from the county land registrar, dated 1892, addressed to Thomas Rowe's father. It referenced a water rights dispute in the Frost Willow corridor and confirmed that all water sources along the eastern ridge remain designated as common agricultural resource, unencumbered by private claim, per the original 1886 settlement agreement. 1886, 1 year before the date on Brackett's document. If there was a common resource designation in 1886, Ronan said, then a private acquisition in 1887 would have required a formal challenge to that designation, which would be in the county records. Which there's no record of, Tamsin said, because it never happened. They looked at each other across the table covered in old paper. That's not proof, she said, because she was honest even when she didn't want to be. It's circumstantial. A good lawyer could argue around it. It's more than we had yesterday, Ronan said. She nodded. She picked up the letter carefully, the way you pick up something fragile that has suddenly become important. That was the afternoon Silas Brackett's men installed the first diversion gate on the upper creek. Dale rode in to tell them at 4 o'clock, his horse blown from the pace he'd set. He stood in Tamsin's doorway, looking at both of them with the expression of a man delivering news he wishes he didn't have. They did it fast, he said. Had the equipment already waiting, gates in, locked, and 2 of his men are sitting upstream with rifles across their saddles. Tamsin put the letter down very carefully. Did anyone try to stop them? Ronan asked. Hicks tried to argue. Brackett's lawyer told him any interference with the installation would constitute trespass on private property and they'd have him arrested. Dale shifted his weight. Nobody else moved. The room was very quiet. "Rifles," Tamsin said. "Across their saddles," Dale said. "Not raised, just there." That was the difference between a threat and a crime, and all three of them knew it. Rifles across saddles was legal. It was also a very clear message about what came next if someone pushed. Tamsin stood up and walked to the window. The light was going out of the afternoon sky, the kind of early dark that November brings to Montana like a punishment. She stood with her back to them, and Ronan watched her shoulders, the particular set of them, the way a person holds themselves when they are deciding not to let something show. "How long before cattle start suffering?" she asked. Her voice was even. 3 days if the temperature drops like they're saying it will," Ronan said. "The lower pools will freeze without the creek flow to keep them open, maybe 4. And if we break the gate? They arrest whoever breaks it, and Brackett gets to paint us as criminals who attacked his lawful property." She turned around. "Which is what he wants. He wants us angry enough to do something he can use." Ronan knew she was right. He also knew that being right about strategy didn't make the cattle any less thirsty. "Then we need to move faster than he is," he said. She crossed her arms. "On what front?" "Both of them." He stood up. "You keep working through your father's papers. Tonight, tomorrow, until you find something with enough weight to take to a judge in Kalispell by letter. A fast writer can get there in a day. I'll go talk to the families who haven't signed yet. Keep them from signing, and I'll talk to the ones who already signed, see if any of them regret it enough to be useful." "And the water?" "I'll dig a temporary diversion on my property. Pull from the upper spring on the north ridge. It won't supply everyone, but it'll keep my herd and yours alive for a week." She stared at him. "That spring is 3 miles from your lower pasture." "I know. That's 2 days of work in the best conditions." "I know that too." She looked at him with an expression he couldn't entirely name, not quite the way she usually looked at him when she was calculating whether his argument held up. Something different, something that had less to do with logic. "You don't have to do this," she said. "This is my fight. Your land isn't in Brackett's documents. He'd probably leave you alone if you—" "He blocked the creek," Ronan said. "That's my water too." She was quiet. "And you're my—" He stopped. He hadn't planned to say that. He didn't have a word for what she was, not one he'd been ready to say out loud in her kitchen, with old letters spread across the table and the last of the afternoon light going gray outside. Neighbor was technically accurate and felt completely wrong. Friend was true, but incomplete. The word he kept circling was one he hadn't said to anyone in a long time, and he wasn't going to say it standing in her kitchen without warning. "My neighbor," he finished. She looked at him for a moment with the eyes of a woman who hears what people don't say as clearly as what they do. Then she looked down at the papers on the table. "Come back tomorrow evening," she said. "I'll have more by then." He nodded, got his coat, got to the door. "Ronan." He stopped. "Thank you," she said. It came out slightly uneven, like the words were less practiced than her usual ones. He didn't say "you're welcome" because it would have felt too formal. He said, "Lock your door tonight," and went out into the November dark. The next 2 days were the kind of work that doesn't feel heroic while you're doing it. Ronan dug the diversion channel in freezing ground with Dale and one other man he trusted. His hands cracked and bled in the cold. The upper spring gave less water than he'd hoped, and the channel kept wanting to pool and freeze before it reached the lower pasture, and he spent the better part of a night rerouting it by torchlight with the temperature dropping to 12 degrees. Meanwhile, Brackett tightened his hold on the valley's center. He had 3 merchants in Frost Willow now: the grain supplier, the hardware man, and the feed store, who had signed agreements that tied their winter inventory to Brackett's cooperation. He didn't threaten them openly. He didn't need to. The message was clear enough. Sign or find yourself short on supplies with a blizzard coming. 2 more families signed. Tamsin came to Ronan's ranch on the 3rd evening, which was the first time she'd come to him rather than waiting for him to come to her. She had a leather folio under her arm, and her face was drawn tight with exhaustion and something close to excitement. She spread 4 documents on his kitchen table. "My father kept copies of everything," she said, including a copy of a letter he sent to the county registrar in 1903, specifically asking whether any private water claims had ever been filed for the Eastern Corridor. "The registrar's written response is here," she pointed. in the registrar's own hand. It says, and I want you to hear this, no private water rights claim has been filed or adjudicated for the Frost Willow Eastern Corridor since the original settlement designation of 1886. The corridor water remains common agricultural resource. Ronan read it again. 1903, he said. 16 years after the date on Brackett's document. If his document were real, this registrar's response would be impossible. The registrar would have had to either be lying or completely unaware of a recorded private claim. And a recorded private claim doesn't disappear from the county registry. Unless the records were altered, Ronan said, or destroyed, or the claim was never real to begin with. She sat down. She was tired, genuinely tired, not the kind she usually hid. I have enough here for a letter to a judge, maybe enough for an injunction to stop Brackett from operating the gate while the claim is investigated. How long does that take? Could be a week, could be 3. She put her hands flat on the table. The blizzard the Hendersons were talking about, weather's been building on the West Ridge for 2 days. If it hits hard before we get a response from Kalispell. She didn't finish it. She didn't have to. Ronan looked at the documents. Then he looked at her face, the shadows under her eyes, the set of her mouth, the particular expression of a person who has been carrying something alone for long enough that it's become habit. He thought about what Dale had said that morning, that he'd overheard one of Brackett's men say the boss was planning to move on the Rowe property directly once the creek situation was settled, that there was talk of a purchase offer she'd have no choice but to accept once her herd started dying. He hadn't told Tamsin this yet. He wasn't sure why he was hesitating, because she deserved to know, because she was not a person you protected by keeping information from her. There's something else, he said. She looked at him. He told her what Dale had heard. He watched her face through it. She didn't flinch. Her expression went through something complex and arrived at a place that was mostly cold anger and mostly controlled. He planned this before he arrived, she said. Looks like. The creek was never the real target. She picked up one of her father's letters and set it down again. The creek was pressure. I'm the target. Your land, Ronan said. He wants the ridge access. The eastern ridge backs onto the northern grazing corridor. Anyone who owns both sides of that valley in 20 years is going to control the route to the summer pastures. She was quiet for a long moment. He did his research, she said finally. So did you, Ronan said, and you were here first. She looked at him across the table, and there was a quality to the silence that was different from the fence-line silences, from the kitchen record silences, something more exposed. The night was pressing against the windows, and outside the wind was starting to pick up off the ridge with the particular tone that meant serious weather coming, and they were sitting across from each other with her father's letters between them and a man somewhere in Frost Willow already planning to take everything she had left. We send the letter to Kalispell tomorrow, she said. First thing. Agreed, he said. And tonight... She stopped. What? I need to think, she said. There's something I'm missing. About the tunnel. He looked at her. What tunnel? She pressed her fingertips to her mouth, thinking. My father mentioned it once, years ago. He said there was an old irrigation tunnel under the eastern ridge, built by the original settlers before the creek diversion was established, abandoned when the creek system was put in. He said it ran from the upper creek to the lower valley on both sides of the ridge. Ronan was very still. If that tunnel still connects, it would bypass Brackett's gate entirely, she said. The water would reach both properties from below. Tamsin, that tunnel would be, he calculated, 40 years old minimum, in mountain ground, after 40 winters. I know. It could have collapsed completely. I know, she said again. I need to find out if my father left any notes about it. She stood up, gathered her folio. She was already thinking past him, past the room, already somewhere in those boxes of her father's careful records. Take one of my horses, he said. The roads are going to be bad tonight. She shook her head. I know the road. Tamsin. He said her name in a way that came out different from usual. Not impatient, not argumentative. Just her name. She paused at the door, looked back at him. Be careful, he said. She held his gaze for a second. Outside, the wind was building. The first real snow of winter was coming in off the mountains, and somewhere in Frost Willow, Silas Brackett was sitting in the back of the saloon feeling like a man who has already won. "I'm always careful," she said. She went out into the dark. Ronan stood in his kitchen looking at the letters on his table and thought about fences and tunnels and the particular stubbornness of a woman who had never once, in all the weeks he'd known her, let a problem be bigger than she was. The wind hit the side of the house hard. The first real snow began to fall. The snow that started falling that night did not stop for 4 days. By the second morning, the roads out of Frost Willow were buried under 14 inches and climbing. The pass to Kalispell was impassable, which meant the letter to the judge in Tamsin's folio was going nowhere. The fast rider Ronan had been planning to send sat in the bunkhouse playing cards and eating through supplies, which was not his fault, but was still a problem. The temperature dropped to 7 degrees, then to 3. Ronan's improvised spring diversion froze solid on the second night. He spent 4 hours in the dark with a pickaxe trying to keep the channel open before Dale physically pulled him away from it and told him he was going to lose fingers if he stayed out any longer. Ronan's hands were so cold by then that he couldn't actually feel the pickaxe handle, which was probably Dale's point. They lost the channel. The spring water backed up and pooled and froze where it sat, useless. The cattle on both properties were now entirely dependent on whatever ice they could break in the lower pools, and the lower pools were fed by what trickled past Brackett's gate, which was a controlled minimum, and everyone knew it. Not enough to kill cattle in a day. Enough to weaken them steadily, in the cold, over a week. It was the kind of slow pressure that was harder to fight than an outright attack, because there was nothing dramatic enough to point to. Just thirsty animals in freezing weather and a gate upstream that a man with lawyers kept saying was his legal right to operate. On the third day of the blizzard, Silas Brackett came to Tamsin's door. He came alone, which was either confidence or a calculated gesture meant to appear reasonable. He knocked this time, which was more than he'd done the first time. And when Tamsin opened the door, he stood on her porch with snow on his hat and an expression of careful sympathy, the kind practiced in front of mirrors. "Miss Rowe," he said, "thought I'd check in, make sure you're managing all right out here." She looked at him the way you look at something you found in a trap, not frightened, just assessing damage. "I'm managing fine," she said. She did not invite him in. "Your cattle looked thin when I rode past this morning," he said. "They look however they look," she said. "Can I help you with something, Mr. Brackett, or did you come out here in a blizzard to discuss my livestock's appearance?" He smiled. It was a good smile, which made it worse. "I came to make you an offer," he said. "A fair one, I think you'll find, given the circumstances. 50 cents on the dollar for the East 40, the barn structure, and the grazing rights on the ridge. You'd walk away with enough to start over somewhere easier than this." Tamsin was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. "You blocked my water supply," she said, "and now you're offering to buy my land at half price because my water supply is blocked. I'm offering a way out of a difficult situation. That you created, before it becomes more difficult." He held her gaze steadily. He was good at this. She suspected he'd had a lot of practice. "The winter's long, Miss Rowe. You're alone out here. There are families in this valley who would thank you for taking a reasonable settlement rather than dragging everyone through months of legal—" "You should go," she said. "Tamsin." "Miss Rowe," she said. Her voice had dropped about 15 degrees, which was a trick Ronan had noticed she could do. "And you should go." He looked at her for a moment. The sympathy left his face. Not that it had ever been real sympathy, but there was something almost restful about seeing the pretense drop, because at least then you were looking at the actual thing. "You're going to make this harder than it needs to be," he said. "I generally do," she said, and closed the door. She stood with her back against it for a moment. Her hands were steady. She was not going to let them shake in her own house. Then she went back to her father's boxes. She'd been through most of them twice now. She had found the registrar's letter that she and Ronan had gone over 3 nights ago. She had found survey receipts and correspondence and 40 years of meticulous record-keeping that proved, circumstantially and collectively, that Brackett's water claim was fiction. What she had not found was anything specific about the tunnel. She found it at 2 in the morning on the 4th day of the blizzard, in a box she'd overlooked because it was labeled, in her father's handwriting, Miscellaneous Equipment Records 1908 to 1921. which was not a box a person opened with any urgency. It was a hand-drawn map, 8 inches by 10 inches, done in pencil on heavy paper that had browned at the edges. Her father's notation at the top said simply, "Original Settler Tunnel, Eastern Ridge, J. Calloway Survey, 1884. She sat on the cold floor of the back room and held the map close to the lamp and looked at it for a long time. The tunnel was real. It had been surveyed. It ran from an entry point on the upper creek, above where Brackett had installed his gate, through the rock of the eastern ridge, and emerged on the valley-facing side at a point that sat squarely between what was now her property and Ronan's. The survey notation said the tunnel was 4 feet wide and roughly 6 feet tall at its highest point, built to carry snowmelt from the upper creek to the original settlement's lower fields before the creek diversion made it obsolete. Her father had written a single note in the margin in his careful hand. Tunnel intact as of 1914. Entrance at Eastern Ridge Base, behind fallen cedar, approximately 80 yards north of the disputed boundary marker. 1914. 32 years ago. She sat on the floor until the lamp started to gutter from the cold draft under the door, and then she got up, put the map inside her coat, and lay down on her bed without taking her boots off. She did not sleep much. She was running calculations that kept coming out to the same uncomfortable answer. 32 years was a long time for a mountain tunnel to stay intact. The eastern ridge was granite underneath, but had shale seams, and shale moved in freeze-thaw cycles. The tunnel could be perfect. It could be partially collapsed. It could be completely closed off 3 feet in, which would mean she'd found a map to a dead end and nothing else. She rode to Ronan's at first light. He was already up, which she'd expected. He was in the barn with 2 of his cattle that had developed the slow, heavy breathing that came with cold stress, working with a kind of focused grimness that made her not want to interrupt him. She waited until he'd finished what he was doing. He looked up and saw her standing at the barn door, and he read her face the way he'd gotten unexpectedly good at doing. "You've found something," he said. She pulled out the map. He came to her, looked at it. She watched him trace the tunnel's path with one finger, stopping at the notations, reading her father's margin note. He was quiet for a long moment, and she could see him doing the same calculations she'd been doing all night. 80 yards north of the disputed boundary marker, he said. "Which puts the entrance on your land," she said. He looked up at her. "My land." "By about 40 feet, she said. "Or, depending on who you ask, 4 feet inside my land, which is technically inside your current fence line." She paused. "I wasn't going to make a point of that right now." "I appreciate your restraint," he said dryly, and went back to the map. She watched him think. She liked, more than she was comfortable admitting, the way Ronan Vale thought through a problem. Not fast and flashy like someone performing cleverness, but methodically testing each piece, going back to recheck what he'd decided. It was, she suspected, why his ranch worked the way it did. Not because he was lucky or gifted, but because he was genuinely careful about things that mattered. "We'd be going in blind," he said finally. "No way to know the condition until we're inside." "I know." "If it collapses with us in it." "I know, Ronan." He folded the map and handed it back to her. "When do you want to go?" She hadn't expected him to ask it quite that directly. She'd expected more argument, more risk calculation, more reasonable objection. "I was thinking today," she said, "before the weather makes the ridge approach any worse." "What do you need?" She told him. Rope, timber braces, tools for clearing debris, lanterns, 2 people minimum. He suggested 3, and she agreed because he was right that 3 was safer. Dale said no. He said it flatly, without drama, looking at the map. And then he looked at Ronan and said, "I'm not going into a 40-year-old mountain tunnel in a blizzard to save cattle, boss. I'll do most things, but that's a place I land." He paused. "I'll take care of the herds while you're gone. Make sure nobody freezes. That's what I can do." It was honest, and they accepted it. Ronan asked young Cobb, who was 22 and did not fully understand how afraid he should be of the thing he was agreeing to, which was probably the only reason he said yes. They went at noon, when the snow let up just enough to see the ridge clearly. The approach to the eastern ridge took over an hour in knee-deep snow. Cobb carried the timber braces and said very little. Ronan carried the rope and most of the tools. Tamsin carried the lanterns and the map, and she led because she was the one who knew where they were going, and she set a pace that was fast enough to be purposeful and slow enough that she didn't exhaust them before they arrived. She found the fallen cedar from her father's notation without much difficulty. It was enormous, long dead, half buried in snow, and it had taken down a section of younger trees when it fell, which had left a clearing that made the ridge base more visible than it might otherwise have been. The tunnel entrance was behind it, partially obscured by decades of debris accumulation. Fallen stone, washed sediment, the detritus of 32 Montana winters. But the arch of the original timber framing was visible once you knew what you were looking for. Ronan began clearing debris from the entrance with a methodical efficiency that Tamsin found herself watching when she should have been helping. She started helping. They had the entrance clear enough to enter after 40 minutes. It was smaller than she'd imagined from the map. The 4-foot width felt much narrower when you were actually standing in front of it, and the original timber framing had sagged on one side so that the clearance at the top was maybe 5 feet, not 6. Ronan was going to have to duck considerably. She held up a lantern and looked in. The first 10 feet were intact. Beyond that, a curve to the right blocked the view. "I'll go first," she said. "You won't," Ronan said. She turned to look at him. "You have the map," he said. "I go first, you follow with the map. Cobb comes last. If something comes down at the front, you can still back out and tell Cobb where to dig." It was logical. It was not why he'd said it, and she knew it, but it was logical enough that arguing with it felt petty. "Fine," she said. He took a lantern, ducked his head, went in. She followed. The tunnel smelled of stone and old water and something earthy that she couldn't name. The floor was wet. Melt water had been finding its way in, which was actually a good sign. It meant the structure was moving water the way it was supposed to. The walls were granite for the first section, solid and cold under her palm when she ran her hand along them to keep her bearings. The lantern light bounced off the dampness and made the space feel more closed than it was. Cobb came in behind her, pulling the timber braces through the entrance with more noise than necessary. They moved in single file. Ronan set a deliberate pace, testing the floor ahead of him with a rod he'd brought, checking for weak spots before he put his weight on them. The tunnel curved right, then straightened, then descended slightly. 60 feet in, they found the first partial collapse, a section of the ceiling where a crack in the granite had let a chunk of stone fall and partially blocked the passage. The stone had lodged at an angle, creating a gap that a person could get through if they went sideways and didn't think too hard about the several hundred pounds of rock balanced above it. Ronan stopped in front of it. "This is the problem," he said. Tamsin came up beside him and looked at it. Cobb came up behind her and made a sound that was not quite a word. "The stone is wedged," she said. "It's been like this for a while. Look at the watermarks on it. It moved and lodged and hasn't moved since. Or it moved and lodged and it's been waiting for the right vibration to finish falling," Ronan said. "That's possible," she said. "But if we brace the right side..." She pointed at the angle of the lodged piece, calculating. "The pressure is coming from the left. If we put a timber brace on the right side and another one at the base, we change the load path enough to pass through safely." He looked at the stone. He looked at her. "How sure are you?" "Reasonably sure." "That's not the same as sure." "No," she said. "It's not." She held his gaze in the lantern light. "I can tell you the logic, and you can decide. I'm not going to pretend there's no risk." That was one of the things he trusted about her, he realized. She didn't perform certainty she didn't have. In a situation like this, in a tunnel, in a mountain, in a blizzard, that was not a small thing. "Show me where to put the braces," he said. They spent 30 minutes on the partial collapse. Cobb held the lanterns. Ronan set the braces where Tamsin indicated, and she was right about the load path. The lodged stone didn't shift, and once the bracing was in, the gap was manageable. Ronan went through first, sideways, not breathing. Then Tamsin. Then Cobb, who was thinner than both of them and got through more easily, and then immediately said, "I don't want to do that again." "You might have to on the way back," Tamsin said. Cobb was quiet for a moment. "Okay." he said in the voice of a young man deciding to be brave about something. They pushed further. 100 feet, 150. The tunnel descended more sharply, and the water on the floor increased, which meant they were in the zone where the upper creek was actively pressuring the stone above them. Tamsin could feel it. Not quite sound, more like a vibration in her back teeth, the weight of water pressing against rock that was pressing against more rock all the way down to where she was standing. At 180 feet, they found the obstruction. It was not a collapse, it was a deliberate blockage. Someone, at some point, had mortared stones across the tunnel width to seal it. Old work, the mortar crumbling at the edges, but solid in the middle. Whoever had sealed this tunnel had not wanted it used again. Tamsin pressed her hands against it, pushed. Nothing. Ronan came up beside her and looked at it. Sealed from this side, he said. See the mortar pattern? It was applied from where we're standing, not from the other end. My father might have done it, she said slowly, after 1914, if the tunnel was creating drainage problems or if he was worried about it as a liability. Can we break through? She looked at the mortar, tested a corner with the point of a tool. The edges crumbled. The center joints are stronger, she said, but the perimeter. She tapped along the junction between the mortared blockage and the tunnel wall. Here, and here. If we work the perimeter, the center section should come free in one piece. How long? She looked at the wall, looked at their tools, thought about the cattle, thought about how long they'd been in the tunnel already, and how long they had before Dale started to worry and did something unhelpful. 2 hours, she said. Maybe less. Ronan took off his coat. He was going to need to swing a tool hard in a confined space, and the coat would restrict him. The temperature in the tunnel was well below freezing. He did it anyway. Then let's start, he said. They worked in shifts, Ronan and Tamsin alternating on the harder strikes, while the other held the lantern, and Cobb kept watch on the partial collapse behind them. The noise in the tunnel was extraordinary. Each strike echoed and re-echoed in the confined space until Tamsin's head was ringing with it. Stone dust fell from the ceiling. The water on the floor was ankle-deep at the base of the blockage, moving sluggishly through small gaps in the mortar at the bottom. 40 minutes in, a crack appeared in the upper left section. Tamsin saw it first. She put her hand on Ronan's arm to stop him mid-swing. He stopped. They both looked at the crack. That's movement, she said. From our side or the other side? She listened. She could hear the water more clearly now, through the crack. Not the slow trickle through the floor gaps, but a proper flow sound, active and pressured. The upper creek was on the other side of this wall. The upper creek that was being blocked by Brackett's gate backed up, building pressure in the system above the ridge. The water is pushing from the other side, she said. The gate is forcing pressure back through the old drainage system. This wall is holding water back. Ronan looked at the crack, looked at her. If we break through, he said slowly, the water doesn't just trickle through. It comes. Yes, she said. Fast. Probably. He ran a hand over his face. Stone dust came off on his fingers. How fast is probably? Faster than we'd like and slower than it could be, she said, which was honest and not very comforting. But the tunnel opens into the lower valley on the other side. The water goes down and out. It doesn't trap us if we move. Move how fast? She looked at the distance back to the entrance. The partial collapse at 180 feet back. The curve. We'd have about 40 seconds, she said. Cobb said, 40 seconds. Approximately, Tamsin said. We should go, Cobb said. I think we should just go. Ronan looked at Tamsin, just looked at her, in the lantern light, with stone dust on his face and cold water around his boots, and a cracked wall of old mortar between them, and what might be either salvation or a very fast way to drown in a mountain. She looked back at him. It's your call, she said. Because it was. She'd brought them here. She'd calculated the path, but she was not going to make this particular decision for both of them without asking. He was quiet for 5 seconds. She counted them. Work the left side of the crack, he said. I'll take the right. We hit it together on my count. When the center section moves, we go. Don't stop for anything. Agreed, she said. Cobb, you're already running when the center moves. Don't wait for us. Cobb swallowed. Yes, sir. They positioned themselves. Ronan's shoulder was 6 inches from hers in the narrow space. She could feel the warmth coming off him, which was a strange thing to notice when she was about to help break open a wall of pressurized water, but she noticed it anyway. "Ready?" he said. "Yes," she said. He counted. 3, 2, 1. They hit the crack simultaneously, left and right. The mortar shattered at the perimeter. The crack widened. She hit it again, and he hit it again, and on the fourth strike the center section shifted. She felt it more than heard it, a deep structural give that traveled up the tool and into her arms. And then the water found the gap, and the gap became an opening, and the opening became a breach, and the sound went from a crack to a roar in approximately 1 second. "Go," Ronan said. She was already going. The water came in cold and fast and immediately knee-deep, and running in it was nothing like running on dry ground. Her legs couldn't move right. The current was pushing her sideways. The lantern was useless, and she dropped it and ran in the dark with one hand on the tunnel wall. Behind her she could hear Ronan, close, and the sound of the water was filling every inch of the tunnel, and her lungs were burning from the cold and the effort. The partial collapse. She felt the stone before she saw it, her shoulder hitting the lodged rock, and she went sideways through the gap by pure instinct and momentum, scraping her back on the upper edge, and came out the other side still moving. She could see the entrance light. Gray rectangle in the dark. Maybe 30 feet. Cobb came through the gap at the same moment she cleared it. She heard him behind her. She did not hear Ronan. She was at the entrance, 20 feet by 15. She went through into the blinding white snow, and cold air hit her face like a wall, and she grabbed the fallen cedar to stop herself from going face first into the snow, and she turned around. Cobb came out 2 seconds later, gasping. The entrance behind them was churning with the force of the water coming through. She stood in the snow with her heart slamming in her chest and her boots full of ice water, and she stared at the tunnel entrance, and she did not move, and she did not breathe. And for 3 seconds that were longer than most minutes she had ever lived through, there was nothing but the roar of the water and the white of the snow and the gray rectangle of the entrance. Ronan came out of it at a full run, hit the snow, stumbled, caught the fallen cedar with one hand, and stood up. He was soaked from the waist down. There was a cut above his right eyebrow from the partial collapse, bleeding in the clean, serious way cuts on the forehead bleed. He was breathing hard. He looked at her. "You're bleeding," she said. Her voice came out completely flat, which was what happened when she was holding something together tightly. "I noticed," he said. Water was beginning to flow from the tunnel entrance now, following the natural slope of the ridge base down toward the valley. Not a flood. A steady, purposeful surge. The movement of water that had been backed up and was now going where it had always been going before someone put a gate in its way. They stood in the snow and watched it move. Cobb sat down in the snow because his legs had made a decision without consulting him. Neither Ronan nor Tamsin said anything to him about it. "It'll take an hour to reach the lower valley," Tamsin said. Her voice was still flat. She was still holding things together. She could feel herself doing it, could feel the specific internal tension of a person who is not going to fall apart in front of anyone. "The cattle will drink tonight," Ronan said. She nodded. Her jaw was shaking slightly. Cold, she told herself. Just cold. He looked at her and she looked at him, and she thought, "We just broke through a mountain together, and the water is moving, and he's bleeding above his eye, and his coat is back in the tunnel, and this is the moment I'm going to remember for the rest of my life, and I cannot say any of that out loud." "We need to get back," she said. "Yes," he said. Neither of them moved for another moment. Then Ronan pulled off the scarf from around his neck, soaking wet and not much good for anything, and pressed it to the cut above his eye. And he looked at Tamsin with the particular expression she'd come to recognize as him, deciding not to say something he'd thought of, and they both turned and started back down the ridge toward the valley. Cobb got up out of the snow and followed them. He didn't say a word all the way down. He was 22 years old, and he had just done something that he suspected he would be telling people about for the next 50 years. He wasn't sure he had the words for it yet. None of them did. Below them, down through the falling snow, the water moved steadily through the frozen valley, following the slope of the ground, finding the low places, heading for the lower pools and the cattle and the 40 families of frost willow who had been waiting in the cold for something to change. Behind Brackett's gate, the water level on the upstream side was dropping. The pressure he'd been building, the careful engineered suffering he'd constructed over 3 weeks of maneuvering and manipulation, was bleeding away through the eastern ridge, and there was nothing he could do about it. He didn't know this yet. He was about to find out. The water reached the lower valley before dark. Ronan knew it when he saw Dale standing at the edge of the lower pasture with his hat in his hand, watching the ground, and then Dale turned and looked at him with an expression that was not quite relief, and not quite disbelief, but something in between that didn't have a clean name. "It's flowing," Dale said. "It's flowing," Ronan confirmed. Dale looked at the cut above Ronan's eye, at the ice-stiffened state of his clothes, at the general condition of all three of them coming down off the ridge, and he made a decision not to ask questions yet. He handed Ronan his own coat instead, because Ronan's was still somewhere in the tunnel, and he said, "Cattle are already moving toward the lower pool." That was enough. That was, in that moment, everything. They got inside. Tamsin sat at Ronan's kitchen table and held a cup of something hot that Dale produced without being asked, and she held it with both hands because her hands were still not entirely steady, and she looked at the table and she let herself be still for a few minutes without performing anything for anyone. Ronan sat across from her with a cloth pressed to his forehead that had stopped bleeding properly and started that stubborn slow seep that shallow head cuts do. Cobb sat in the corner wrapped in a blanket and said nothing to anybody, which was the most sensible thing any of them had done in hours. Outside, the snow had let up again. It did that in Montana, came in hard, let up, came back. The sky had gone the pale orange of a winter evening, which meant the cloud cover was thinning, which meant the temperature was going to drop another 10 degrees overnight, which was a problem for tomorrow. Tonight, the cattle were drinking. "Brackett's men are going to notice the pressure drop upstream," Tamsin said. She was staring at the table, thinking out loud more than talking to him. "When they do, they'll figure out the bypass." "And then what?" Ronan said. "Then they'll try to find the tunnel entrance and block it." She looked up. "Or they'll escalate some other way. He didn't come this far to watch a workaround undo his gate." Ronan thought about that. He thought about Silas Brackett sitting in the back of the saloon, working through his options and arriving, as calculating men in bad positions often do, at the conclusion that more force was the answer. He was right to think about it. He just didn't think about it fast enough. The fire started at 3 in the morning. Dale saw the light from the bunkhouse window and was out the door before he was fully awake. By the time he got Ronan up, the east side of Tamsin's barn was burning in the way old dry wood burns in cold air, fast, hot, and total. The snow on the ground reflected the orange light, so it seemed like the whole valley was glowing. Ronan was already moving before Dale finished the sentence. He was across the fence line, across the property, at the burning barn in less than 10 minutes, and Tamsin was already there ahead of him, which should not have surprised him, and did anyway. She had a line on the 2 horses still inside, and was pulling them toward the barn door through smoke that made her eyes stream and her chest heave with each breath. Ronan went in past her. She grabbed his arm. "The left stall beam is already compromised." "Which horses are still inside?" "The roan and the gray. The gray is panicking." He pulled free and went in. The roan came to him because horses sometimes make good decisions when humans are too frightened to. He had her out in under a minute. The gray was in the back stall with her eyes white and her hooves hitting the stall boards in blind terror, and getting a lead on her took longer because she kept pulling away, and the smoke was getting heavier, and somewhere above him the loft was going. He could hear it going. The sound of burning timber is not the sound people imagine from a distance. He got the lead on her. She nearly took him off his feet going through the door. He let her drag him rather than fight her, and they came out into the snow-lit dark, and the cold air hit his lungs like a door slamming, and he bent over for a moment just breathing. Tamsin was beside him. Her hand was on his back, between his shoulder blades, and she was not saying anything. She was just there, which was so unlike her usual mode of interaction that it told him more than words would have. By the time the settlers from the nearest properties arrived, the barn was beyond saving. They kept the fire from spreading to the house, which was the only thing that could be saved, and they did it by hauling water in buckets from the lower pool in relay lines, 20 degrees, in the dark. Edna Marsh's husband worked the relay line with his bad hip until his wife made him stop. George Paulson, who had signed Brackett's agreement 3 weeks ago, worked it until the fire died. At some point during the bucket line, Ronan noticed that most of Frost Willow was standing in Tamsin's yard. Not all of them, not the ones who were too far or too frightened, but most of them. In the morning, what was left of the barn was a blackened frame standing in snow that had melted in a circle around it and refrozen into gray ice. Tamsin stood and looked at it for a long time. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say about it that the looking didn't already cover. Ronan stood beside her. "Your father built that," he said. It wasn't a question. "In 1901, she said. "Him and 2 neighbors. Took them 3 weeks. She paused. "The neighbors moved away years ago. My father said he always meant to find them and tell them what the barn had become. He never did." Ronan looked at the frame. "We'll rebuild it." She shook her head, not arguing with him exactly. More like she was setting that aside for later, for when it wasn't a smoldering frame in front of her. "What I want to know," she said, her voice going carefully level, "is whether anyone in this valley is going to look at this and still believe Silas Brackett's interest here is legitimate." As if on cue, George Paulson walked over from where he'd been standing with a group of men near the fence. He had soot on his coat from the bucket line, and he looked like he hadn't slept. He stopped in front of Tamsin, and he held his hat in his hands the way men hold their hats when they're about to say something they should have said sooner. "Miss Rowe," he said, "I signed his paper." "I know," she said. "My wife and I talked last night." He looked at the barn, then back at her. "That paper means nothing if this is who he is." He paused. "I want to know what you need." Tamsin looked at him for a moment. Her face did something complicated. Not forgiveness exactly, not yet, but an acknowledgement that people in hard positions made choices they later regretted, and that this man standing in her yard at 7 in the morning with soot on his coat was trying to correct his. "I need to get to the marshal," she said. "The roads are still bad." "Hicks has a horse that can make the North Pass," George said. "He offered it last night. And I can ride. I've done the Winter Pass before." He paused again. "You have documents? Evidence?" "I do," she said. "Then let me take them." It wasn't the perfect solution. It was a man with a borrowed horse in uncertain weather, with documents that were compelling but not yet verified, heading to find a marshal who might or might not be back from Kalispell. It was the best available option, which was a different thing from a good option, but it was what they had. Tamsin went inside and put together what she had. The registrar's letter, her father's map, the survey documentation, the 1892 correspondence referencing the Common Resource Designation. She wrote a letter of her own in clear, plain language explaining what each document proved and what it suggested about the filing number inconsistency in Brackett's claim. She wrote it without emotion and without exaggeration, the way her father had taught her to write anything that needed to be believed. She handed the packet to George Paulson. He took it with both hands. "There's something else," Ronan said from behind her. She turned. He had been standing in the doorway, and he had the expression he got when he'd made a decision he wasn't entirely sure she was going to agree with. "Dale saw something when we came down off the ridge yesterday," Ronan said. "I didn't mention it because there were other things happening, but when the water came through the tunnel and hit the lower valley, it moved along the base of the ridge east toward the creek bed. Dale said it pushed through a section of Brackett's dam structure, the physical earthwork supporting the gate, not the gate itself. The water undercut the north edge of it." Tamsin stared at him. "He didn't tell me this." "He told me at midnight when I couldn't sleep. He wasn't sure it was significant." Ronan looked at her steadily. "I think it is. If the dam base is undercut, the whole structure is compromised. A good freeze-thaw cycle or another surge from the tunnel, and the gate doesn't just stop working, it fails. And when it fails, the water comes through hard enough to move anything that isn't bolted down." She was already seeing it. She could see the physics of it, the way her father had taught her to read water movement across land, the way water found weakness, the way a small undercut became a large one, the way what looked like a stable structure could be one cold night away from giving way. "The crates," she said. Ronan nodded. "Brackett's been storing materials at the gate site. Equipment," his worker said. Dale thought he saw document cases in the early deliveries, the kind lawyers use for original files. She looked at him. "He's keeping his documents at the dam site." "I don't know that. Dale thinks he saw cases. Could be equipment, could be nothing. Or it could be the original forged documents and anything else he doesn't want found in his offices, she said slowly. If he's been doing this in other valleys before Frost Willow, buying up water rights with forged claims, he wouldn't keep evidence like that somewhere it could be searched. Ronan said nothing. He let her think. If the dam fails and the water moves those cases, she said, whatever's inside goes downstream, in December. Or someone finds them first, he said. She looked at him for a long time. Ronan, what exactly are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything, he said. I'm telling you what Dale observed. What happens next is weather and physics. George Paulson had been listening to this exchange with the expression of a man who was following most of it and was not sure whether to be impressed or worried. He looked at the document packet in his hands. Should I be writing faster? He asked. Yes, Tamsin and Ronan said at the same time. George left within the hour. Ronan moved Tamsin's remaining horses to his barn, which she accepted without arguing, which told him something about how she was holding up. He brought the 2 cattle most at risk from the cold stress into his covered pen. He did these things matter-of-factly, without asking permission, and she let him, which was its own form of communication between 2 people who had recently been inside a mountain together and were not yet ready to talk about it. The valley was different that day. The fire had done something that Brackett probably hadn't intended. It had made the situation visible in a way that legal documents and water rights debates hadn't. People in Frost Willow understood fire. They understood a barn that a man had built in 1901 with his neighbors standing as a blackened frame in the snow. They understood that you didn't do that to someone's livelihood because of a water rights dispute. Edna Marsh came by in the afternoon and sat with Tamsin for an hour. Ronan heard them talking in the kitchen when he came in from the barn, Edna's voice steady and Tamsin's quieter than usual. And he went back outside because that conversation wasn't for him. He spent an hour doing unnecessary maintenance on his fence line and thought about the dam and the water and the document cases and the particular way that the truth sometimes had to be shaken loose from where it was hiding rather than simply found. At 4 in the afternoon, one of Brackett's hired men came to find Ronan. He was a young man, 25 at most, with the look of someone who had taken a job without fully understanding what kind of job it was going to be. He stood at the edge of Ronan's property and called out rather than crossing the fence, which was either courtesy or self-preservation. "Mr. Vale," he said. "Mr. Brackett would like to speak with you." "I expect he would," Ronan said. "He's asking if you'll come to the saloon." "I know where he is," Ronan said. He looked at the young man. "You were on the gate last night." The young man's expression shifted slightly. "I was on the upper site. During the fire." A pause. "We were told to stay on the upper site." "By Brackett." "By Mr. Brackett." "Yes, sir." Ronan looked at him for a moment. "You're from where? Not Montana." "Wyoming," the young man said. "You have people in Wyoming?" "Yes, sir. Parents, 2 sisters." "Go home," Ronan said. The young man blinked. "Sir?" "Go home to Wyoming. Tell Brackett you quit. You don't want to be here for what comes next." The young man stood there for a moment with the expression of someone who has just been handed information they're not sure whether to trust. Then he said, "Is that a threat, sir?" "No," Ronan said. "It's a fact. There's a difference." He picked up the tool he'd set down when the man arrived. "Tell Brackett I'll speak to him tomorrow. In public. At the general store where anyone who wants to can hear the conversation." The young man went back the way he'd come. Ronan watched him go and thought, Brackett isn't going to wait for tomorrow. Brackett is going to do something tonight. The fire had been desperation wearing the mask of intimidation, and desperation in a calculating man didn't wait on meeting requests. He went and found Tamsin. She was in his barn, checking on the horse she'd brought over from her property, running her hand along the animal's neck in the absent way people do when they're using a familiar task to hold their thoughts still. She heard him come in and didn't turn around. "He sent someone," Ronan said. "I saw. She had apparently been watching from somewhere." "What did you tell him?" "That I'd meet Brackett publicly tomorrow, at Fletcher's." She turned around then. "He won't like that." "No. He'll do something tonight." "That's what I think," Ronan said. She looked at him with those eyes that processed things fast and said what they saw, whether she wanted them to or not. "You're not going to bed tonight," she said. "Neither are you," he said. She didn't argue with that. She went back to the horse for a moment, then said, without turning around, "When this is over, I'm going to sleep for approximately 4 days." "When this is over," he said, "I'll make sure nobody bothers you." She was quiet. Then, "That's a large promise." "I keep the ones I make," he said. She turned and looked at him then, really looked at him, the full direct gaze she gave to things she was taking seriously. The barn was cold, and the lamplight was yellow, and his face still had the cut above the eyebrow from the tunnel, and she thought, not for the first time, that this man was not what she'd expected when a stubborn rancher had shown up at her fence with her hen under his arm 2 months ago. She didn't say any of that. She said, "All right, what's the plan?" They stayed up. They divided the watch. Ronan on the north side toward the gate, Dale on the south toward the road, Tamsin inside with the documents and the lamp turned down low enough not to signal activity. Cobb, who had finally recovered enough to be useful, kept watch on the ridge path. Brackett's move came at 2 in the morning, but it wasn't fire this time, and it wasn't his hired men. It was the dam. The undercut that Dale had seen the day before had spent the intervening 36 hours doing what water and cold do to compromised earthworks, working quietly, invisibly, finding every small weakness, expanding the hollow beneath the dam's north foundation until the structure above it was held up by less and less. The temperature had dropped to -8 overnight. The freeze-thaw cycle had run its course. At 2:14 in the morning, the north section of Brackett's gate dam gave way. Ronan heard it from the ridge path, a sound like a very large piece of furniture falling, followed by a sustained rush that was a different quality from ordinary water movement. He was moving before he'd consciously decided to, up the slope toward the gate site, and he got there in time to see the water moving across the flat ground at the base of the dam structure with more energy than a freed stream should have had, because the backed-up volume above the gate had been sitting under pressure for weeks and now it had somewhere to go. The gate itself was still standing, one section of it. The earthwork dam that had supported the gate's north end was simply gone, collapsed into the current, and the water was routing around and under the remaining structure with the calm efficiency of water that has been waiting. And the crates were in the water. 4 of them, the heavy lawyer's document cases that Dale had seen in the early deliveries, had been stored in a dry alcove on the north bank directly adjacent to the collapsed section. 3 were moving downstream. One had caught on a protruding root and was open at one corner, papers already wet, fanning out into the current. Ronan went into the water. It was thigh-deep and moving hard, and it was the worst temperature he had experienced outside of the tunnel, which was saying something. He got to the snagged case, got his hands on it, got it to the bank. He could hear shouting from the direction of the saloon, Brackett's men responding to the collapse, and he did not have much time. He got 2 of the moving cases. The third was gone downstream, and he let it go because the current was too strong and the temperature was doing things to his ability to think clearly. He got the 3 cases to the bank. His legs below the thigh were not entirely under his voluntary control anymore, which was the point at which a person should get out of water in Montana in December, and he got out. He opened the snagged case first because it was already compromised, and the water had done the work of separating the contents. The first document he pulled out was a land deed. The second was a water rights agreement. The third was a letter, addressed from a law firm in Billings, referencing a settlement in Powder River County involving falsified boundary claims. He looked at these things in the dark with his legs going numb and the sound of Brackett's men getting closer, and he understood that what he was holding was not just evidence of what had happened in Frost Willow. It was a pattern. This was not the first valley. He put everything back in the case. He took the cases to higher ground and left them behind a section of old fencing 50 yards from the dam site, hidden but accessible. He marked the spot in his memory and walked back toward the ranch. Brackett's men reached the dam site 4 minutes later. He heard them from the tree line. He heard one of them say, "The cases." He heard another one say, "They were right there." Then a third voice, quieter, colder, "Find them." That was Brackett's voice. Brackett was there himself, which meant he'd been awake and close, which meant he'd expected the dam to fail, which meant the cases being stored there had been a miscalculation on his part rather than a plan. Ronan stood in the dark and waited for them to give up looking, which took 20 minutes, And then he went home and sat at his kitchen table and looked at his hands until feeling came back into them, which was deeply unpleasant. At 5 in the morning, he sent Dale to Tamsin with a message. She arrived at 6. He showed her the cases. She opened them herself, methodically, the way she did everything, carefully, completely. She read for 40 minutes without speaking. He sat across from her and let her read. She put the last document down and looked at him. Powder River County, she said. There's a reference to Custer County too, he said. Different incident, same method. Forged historical claim, water pressure, land acquisition at collapse price. She was quiet for a moment. He's done this 3 times. At least 3 times. There may be more in the 3rd case. She looked at the documents. Her face was doing the controlled outrage thing, the specific stillness that meant she was furious and had decided to be precise about it rather than loud. The original county records are in here too, she said. Frost Willow's actual records. He must have gotten to the county office. She stopped. That's how the filing numbers were wrong. He replaced the originals with his forgeries and kept the originals as insurance, so he could prove legitimacy if someone with authority pushed hard enough. And if nobody pushed hard enough, Ronan said, the forgeries sat in the county office as the only record. The original records prove his documents are fake, she said, and the letters from Powder River prove it's a pattern, not a mistake. She looked at him across the table. Where did you find these? In the creek, he said, which was technically accurate. She looked at him steadily. He looked back at her with the expression he used when he was being precise without being complete. Ronan, she said. The dam failed, he said. The cases were in the water. I retrieved them. That's the sequence. That is a very edited sequence. It's an accurate one. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, You went into the water in December, at night. The water was moving fast, he said. Things get wet. She pressed her lips together. He couldn't tell if she was going to say something sharp or something else entirely. The moment balanced on a point. You are the most aggravating man in this valley, she said. You've mentioned that, he said. I'm going to mention it again. But her voice had shifted slightly. The edge was still there, but underneath it was something warmer, something that had nothing to do with aggravation. She looked down at the documents. George needs to get these to the marshal. All of them, not just my father's records. She started organizing them with the focused efficiency that was her natural state. And the marshal needs to know about Powder River County, because that's a separate jurisdiction, and there will be a separate sheriff who'd be very interested in knowing where Silas Brackett currently is. I'll get a writer out before 8, Ronan said. She nodded, still organizing. Then she stopped. She put both hands flat on the table and looked at the surface of it rather than at him, which was not her usual mode, and said, I don't know how to... She stopped again. He waited. Thank you, she said. It came out the same way it had the first time she'd said it, slightly uneven, like the words were less practiced than everything else she said. Not just for last night, for all of it. You didn't have to stay in this. I know, he said. You keep saying you know, she said. I'm trying to understand why. He looked at her. He thought about everything he'd said and not said in the last 2 months, about the fence and the property lines and the word he'd stopped himself from saying in her kitchen when Brackett was just starting to show his hand. He thought about the way she'd said, only if you ask me in Fletcher's store, and walked out into November without looking back. I think you know why, he said. She looked up at him then. Outside, the sky was going from black to the specific gray-blue that is the first real sign of a Montana winter dawn. The documents were spread between them. The morning was coming, and somewhere downstream Silas Brackett was standing at a ruined dam trying to understand what had gone wrong and where his insurance had disappeared to. She looked at Ronan for a long moment, and she did not look away, and she did not say anything, and that was, for the first time in their entire acquaintance, more than enough. The marshal arrived on the 4th day after the dam failed. His name was Calloway, and he was a practical man in his 50s who had seen enough land fraud in his career to recognize the shape of it quickly. He arrived with 2 deputies and a letter from the county judge in Kalispell that gave him authority to hold and examine any documents relevant to the water rights claim filed under Brackett's name. George Paulson had made the ride in difficult conditions and had apparently been persuasive in his presentation, because the marshal had moved faster than anyone had expected. He came to Ronan's property first because that was where the documents were. Tamsin was already there. She had been there most mornings for the past 4 days, working through the material in the recovered cases, organizing it, writing a careful index of each document with its relevance noted in the margin. She had done this with the same methodical focus she brought to everything, and she had done it without being asked, and when Ronan had pointed out at some point on the second day that she didn't have to keep coming over here to do work, she could do anywhere, she had looked at him and said, "The documents are here," which was technically true and completely beside the point, and they both knew it. Marshal Calloway sat at Ronan's kitchen table and went through what Tamsin handed him. He was not a fast reader, but he was a thorough one. He asked questions at specific points about the filing number inconsistency, about the 1892 registrar's letter, about the chain of custody for the recovered cases, and Tamsin answered each one without embellishment. She handed him her father's map, the survey documentation, the original county records that Brackett had replaced with his forgeries. At a certain point, the marshal stopped reading and looked up and said, "Miss Rowe, did you compile all of this yourself?" "My father compiled most of it," she said, "over 40 years. I organized it." Calloway looked at the index she'd written. He looked at the recovered documents. He looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating his expectations. "Where's Brackett now?" he asked, directing this at Ronan. "Saloon," Ronan said. "He hasn't left Frost Willow. I think he was waiting to see what turned up." "Or waiting to see what didn't," Tamsin said. Calloway stood up. He told his deputies to stay with the documents. Then he put on his hat and went to find Silas Brackett. Ronan and Tamsin did not go with him. This was not their role, and they both understood it. Ronan stood on his porch and watched the marshal ride toward town. Tamsin stood beside him, and neither of them spoke for a while, and the valley below them was white and quiet under the December sky. "It's not over yet," she said. "No," he agreed. "He'll have an explanation for the Powder River documents. His lawyer will argue the original county records were already damaged before he arrived. He'll say the cases ended up in the water because of the dam failure, not because he stored them there." "All of that's possible," Ronan said. "Possible isn't the same as true." "No, but it's enough to slow things down." He looked at the valley. "It's going to take time. Weeks, maybe months before a judge makes a final determination." She was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said. "I've known that since the beginning. Legal processes take time. That's not the part that worries me." He looked at her. "What's the part that worries you?" She didn't answer immediately. She looked at the burned frame of her barn still standing at the edge of her property across the fence line, black against the snow. She'd been looking at it every morning with the same expression, the one that was not grief exactly, but was something adjacent to it. The specific loss of something your father built, which is different from the loss of a building. "The people here will remember I caused trouble," she said finally. "That even if Brackett goes to prison and the water rights are confirmed and everything comes out right, some of them will remember the winter their cattle were thirsty and their families were short on supplies, and they'll connect that to me, because I was the one who said out loud that he was a fraud." Ronan thought about that. He thought about it honestly, because she deserved an honest answer rather than a reassuring one. "Some of them might," he said. She nodded, like she'd expected that. "And some of them hauled water in a bucket line at 20 degrees to keep your house from burning," he said. "George Paulson rode the winter pass with your documents. Edna Marsh sat with you for an hour the morning after the fire." He paused. "People are complicated. They can be frightened and cowardly and also show up when it counts. It doesn't always have to be one or the other." She looked at him. "That's a generous way to see it." "It's an accurate one," he said. "You taught me that. The difference between generous and accurate." Something moved across her face that she didn't quite manage to keep still. She turned back toward the valley. The arrest happened that afternoon. It was not dramatic in the way arrests look dramatic from a distance. There was no shouting, no chase, no moment of violent confrontation. The marshal walked into the saloon with his 2 deputies, talked to Silas Brackett for approximately 15 minutes, and then Brackett came out wearing his coat and not wearing his usual expression of patient amusement. He looked, for the first time since he'd arrived in Frost Willow, like a man who understood the specific ground he was standing on. His lawyer tried to file an immediate objection. Calloway told him he was welcome to do that in Kalispell. 3 of Brackett's hired men left that evening. The Wyoming boy was among them, which Ronan had expected. The 4th man, the one who'd been operating the gate, stayed and asked to give a statement to the marshal, which was the kind of decision a person makes when they want to be on the cleaner side of a legal proceeding before someone else gets there first. Ronan heard all of this from Dale, who had appointed himself the Valley's informal news service and took the role seriously. He relayed it to Tamsin over coffee. Actual coffee this time, in his kitchen, with the documents cleared off the table and the morning coming in the window with the particular quality of December light that is almost silver when it reflects off snow. "The gate's unmanned," Ronan said. "I know," she said. "I want to take it down today." He looked at her. "Today." "It's still blocking the creek. The tunnel bypass is working, but the gate is structurally compromised from the dam failure, and if it shifts, it could redirect the flow into the low field instead of the channel." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "Also," she said, more quietly, "I just want it gone." He understood that. Some things you need to be done with. They went up to the gate site that afternoon with Dale and Cobb and George Paulson, who had come over in the morning and asked what needed doing with the kind of directness that required no ceremony. The gate was heavy iron and waterlogged timber, and taking it apart was cold, hard, unpleasant work that took 3 hours and left everyone's hands raw. George worked without complaining. Cobb worked and complained intermittently, which was his natural mode, and nobody minded. When the last section came free and the creek ran clear through the site without obstruction for the first time in weeks, everyone was quiet for a moment. Not a ceremonial quiet, just the kind that happens when something that was wrong is simply no longer wrong, and there's not much to say about it. Tamsin stood at the bank and watched the water move. "My father would have said something wise right now," she said. "What would he have said?" George asked. She thought about it. "He would have said water finds its way eventually, and then he would have gone home for dinner." George laughed. It was a short, tired laugh, but it was real. The legal process took, as Ronan had predicted, time. The county judge issued a preliminary ruling in January suspending Brackett's water claim pending investigation. The investigation confirmed the filing number inconsistency that Tamsin had identified. The file reference on Brackett's document corresponded to a numbering system the state archive had not used until 1901, 14 years after the document claimed to originate. This was, as the investigating attorney wrote in his report, not ambiguous. The Powder River County Sheriff's Office made contact in February because a similar claim had been filed there and 2 families had signed over water rights that they were now trying to recover. The pattern that Ronan had seen in the documents on that cold December morning was confirmed through a different jurisdiction's records. Brackett's lawyer argued through January and into February. He was good, as Tamsin had predicted. The arguments about document custody, about the recovered cases, about what constituted tampered county records were real arguments that a judge had to take time with. But real arguments aren't the same as winning arguments. And by March, the picture was clear enough that the county judge issued a final ruling. The original 1886 Common Resource designation stood. The water was public. It had always been public. And the man who had tried to claim otherwise was being held on charges of fraud, document forgery, and arson pending a criminal trial in Kalispell. The land records were the last thing. The county surveyor came out in late March, when the ground had softened enough to work with. He was a methodical man named Pritchard, who said very little and measured everything twice. He used the original 1886 survey markers that Thomas Rowe had known about for decades, and that had simply been ignored because the fence had always been where it was, and nobody had forced the issue. Until now. Pritchard packed up his equipment and told Ronan Vale, standing at the east fence line with his hat in his hand. "The fence is 4 feet inside the Rowe property, has been since it was built. Would you like that in writing?" Ronan said yes. He got it in writing. He stood in his yard that evening with the surveyor's report and thought about the first morning. The brown hen on the wrong side of the fence, the woman coming across her yard carrying a fence post, the absolute certainty in her voice when she said 4 feet short of where it should be. He had spent 2 months arguing about it. He had spent another 3 months in increasingly high-stakes circumstances where the fence had stopped being the point entirely. The fence had always been the point. He just hadn't understood that yet. He moved it himself. He did it on a Saturday morning in late March, first warm day of the year, and he didn't ask for help because it was his fence and his mistake and some things you do yourself. It took him most of the day. The posts on the eastern side had to come out and go back in 4 feet toward his property, and the ground was soft from the melt but still cold under the top layer, and it was real work that left him tired in a way that felt appropriate. Tamsin appeared at the property line around 3 in the afternoon. She watched him set the last post. She watched him string the wire. She didn't say anything until he was done, and then she walked to where the fence now stood, and she looked at the line of it, 4 feet closer to where it should have been all along. "It's right," she said. "I know," he said. She looked at him over the new fence line. He was dirty from the work and tired, and the post driver was still in his hand, and he had not planned this as a moment of any particular significance. He just wanted it done. "Your family built it wrong," she said. "I know that too." "And you moved it." "That's correct." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the fence. Then, "My father spent 10 years trying to get that conversation started with your father. Your father wouldn't hear it." Ronan nodded. He knew this. He had found letters in his own family's files over the winter, old letters from Thomas Rowe that his father had never answered. He had not told Tamsin about those letters yet. He wasn't sure he ever would. Some things between families were better settled by action than by reopening what the previous generation had refused to acknowledge. "I'm sorry it took as long as it did," he said. She looked at him then, not the assessing look, not the calculating look, something quieter. "It didn't take as long as it could have," she said. They stood on either side of the correctly placed fence, and the afternoon was warm for March, warm enough to smell the ground thawing under the snowmelt, and Ronan thought about what to say next and found that the problem with having spent 2 months arguing with someone is that when the argument is over, you've been so thoroughly in each other's company that whatever comes next should already be obvious. Maybe it was. Maybe it had been obvious for a while, and he'd just been the last to say it clearly. "I want to court you," he said. She blinked. It was the first time he'd seen her actually caught off guard by something he'd said, and it was, in its own way, satisfying. "That's very formal," she said. "I'm a formal person." "You are, actually," she said. "I've noticed that." She looked at the fence again. "You moved it first, before asking." "The fence was a separate thing from asking," he said. "The fence was the right thing to do regardless of what you said." She looked at him steadily for a moment. He held the look. "You win the fence dispute," he said. "You were right from the beginning. I'm saying that in front of whoever's listening, which right now is just the fence posts, but I'll say it in town if you want." "I don't need you to say it in town," she said. "Then I'm saying it here." He paused. "Will you let me court you properly, Tamsin?" It wasn't quite a question. She noticed that. It was phrased like one, but it landed like something steadier. Not demanding, just certain. The way he said things when he'd already committed to them. She thought about a brown hen crossing a fence line. She thought about a man showing up on a Thursday to look at county records he didn't want to accept, and then showing up again and again with decreasing pretexts and increasing honesty. She thought about a tunnel in a mountain and water moving through the dark, and his shoulder 6 inches from hers in the freezing space, and the weight of his hand on the back of her neck after they came out, just briefly, that she had not mentioned to anyone. She thought about her father, who had been a careful and patient man, and who had taught her that the most important things were worth waiting for and worth fighting for, but that knowing the difference between the two was the work of a lifetime. "You can court me," she said, "after you acknowledge that I won the fence dispute." He said, without hesitation, "You won the fence dispute." "Completely," she said. "Completely," he said. "From the first day." She smiled. It was a real smile, not the controlled one she used with people she was still deciding about. And it changed her face in the way that real smiles do, not making it prettier exactly, but making it more itself, more fully what it actually was. "Then yes," she said, "you can court me properly." He didn't smile back immediately. He just looked at her with the expression that was his version of relief. Quiet, internal, the kind that doesn't make a show of itself. Then he said, "I'll come by tomorrow, for coffee." "Come early," she said. I have things to do. How early? She turned and walked back toward her house, which was the same thing she'd done that first day when she'd told him to come by Thursday. Just turned and walked, leaving him to figure out the rest. Then she stopped and looked back over her shoulder. Before coffee, she said. He was there before first light. The Valley Council elected Tamsin to manage the Water Rights Committee in April, which surprised people who hadn't been paying attention and no one who had. She reorganized the valley's irrigation agreements over the spring and summer, establishing shared water rights with provisions that prevented any single landowner from controlling access to the creek system. She wrote the charter herself, in the same clear and precise language she'd used for the marshal's documents, and she got 9 signatures on it before anyone had time to object. Edna Marsh said it was the most sensible thing to come out of Frost Willow in 20 years. The valley rebuilt Tamsin's barn in June. This was not formally organized by anyone. It simply happened, the way barn raisings happen in places where people understand that what falls down in a community belongs to the community to put back up. George Paulson brought timber. Hicks brought hardware. Dale organized the work crews with the efficiency of a man who had been managing difficult people in difficult conditions for most of his adult life. Ronan worked alongside everyone else and did not attempt to be in charge, which was a more conscious decision than it appeared. Cobb turned out to be better at framing than anyone had expected. He didn't say much about the tunnel, but he'd told the barn-raising story to every person who asked twice, and by the third telling he'd edited his own fear out of it entirely and replaced it with competence, which was a young man's prerogative. Tamsin stood at the edge of the site on the third day and watched the frame go up, and she was quiet in the way she'd been quiet looking at the ruins, but completely different. Something settled instead of something raw. Ronan came to stand beside her. He did this now without ceremony, without pretext, without needing a reason. She had stopped needing a reason for it too. Your father would have complained about the angle on the east wall, she said. He looked at the east wall. See, the angle's fine. He complained about everything, she said fondly. He didn't mean anything by it. He looked at her. You never told me that before. There are a lot of things I haven't told you yet, she said. Tell me at dinner, he said. Tell you which things? All of them, he said. We have time. They married the following spring, when the valley was coming out of its last hard winter, and the upper creek ran full and clear past the site of the old gate, which had been completely cleared and showed no sign that anything had ever interrupted the water's path. The wedding was simple in the way that weddings are simple when the people getting married are more interested in the fact of it than the ceremony. A few words, the people they trusted, the valley spread below them in the April light. They removed the dividing fence the week after. It was Ronan's suggestion, and Tamsin agreed without discussion, because what had once been the most contested line in Frost Willow had become, after everything, a little absurd as a division. They combined the properties into a single deed under both their names. The Land Council, at Tamsin's suggestion, planted the old fence line with native grass. By summer, you couldn't tell where it had been. What they built together was not perfect. No ranch is. There were dry years and harder winters and disputes over management decisions that sometimes went on for days and occasionally ended with one of them sleeping in the wrong house. Ronan was stubborn in the specific way that stubborn people are stubborn when they know they're right, which was often enough to be a genuine ongoing problem. Tamsin was precise to a degree that could shade into inflexibility when she was tired or frightened, and she was sometimes frightened and didn't say so, which was its own kind of wall. They were, in other words, themselves. Imperfect, specific, particular people who had found in each other not a solution to who they were, but a witness to it. That turned out to be enough. More than enough. The children who grew up on Vale Row Ranch heard the story in pieces, the way children hear the stories that matter, not as a formal history, but as references and fragments that accumulate over years into something like understanding. They knew about the hen before they knew the full story. They knew about the tunnel before they understood why it mattered. They knew that their parents argued about coffee with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to coffee, and that this was somehow connected to everything else, and it took most of them until they were grown to understand what that connection actually was. One of them, a daughter who had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness in equal measure, Asked Tamsin once, she was maybe 12, maybe 13, sitting at the kitchen table while Tamsin worked, why her father had moved the fence before he asked to court her, whether that was the right order. Tamsin thought about it. It was the honest order, she said. The fence was a debt that needed paying regardless of what came next. If he'd paid it to influence the answer, it wouldn't have meant what it meant. Her daughter thought about this. So he paid it first so it would be real. So it would be his, Tamsin said, not a trade, just the right thing done because it was right. Her daughter nodded slowly with the expression of a young person filing something away for later. Decades passed in the way that good decades pass. Not quickly, not slowly, but fully, with the ordinary weight of lived time. The valley changed around them, as valleys do. Families came and went. The town grew in some directions and contracted in others. The irrigation system that Tamsin had designed outlasted the people who remembered why it had been built, which was exactly what she had intended. On a particular evening in late October, the light going gold off the ridge, the cattle settled, the season changing with the deliberateness that Montana autumn has. Ronan and Tamsin sat together on the south side of the house where you could see most of the valley spread below. They had been sitting like this for years, long enough that they had a specific way of doing it, specific chairs and a specific arrangement, the kind of worn-in routine that looks ordinary from outside and feels like the whole of something from inside. Ronan had his coffee. He'd been making it the same wrong way for decades, which remained a point of ongoing discussion. "You still put too much water," Tamsin said. "It's fine," he said. "It's weak," she said. "You like it strong because your father liked it strong, and you've never questioned whether that's actually your preference." She looked at him. He looked at the valley. "That is a deeply irritating thing to say," she said. "It's accurate," he said. She took his cup and drank from it. She handed it back without comment. He watched the light change on the eastern ridge, the ridge that held the tunnel, that held the winter they'd gone through together in the dark, with freezing water at their ankles, and something like trust being built in the specific conditions that trust requires. Not ease, not safety, but honest need and someone who stayed. "You know what I think about sometimes," he said. "What?" "That hen," he said. "Where she thought she was going." Tamsin was quiet for a moment. She knew exactly where she was going, she said. She went through the fence every chance she got for 2 years. She knew what was on both sides. "Smarter than me," he said. "She was," Tamsin agreed pleasantly. He looked at her. She was looking at the valley, the same valley she'd been looking at her whole life, the same ridge and the same creek and the same last light on the mountains her father had watched from this same elevation. She was older now, and not in ways she tried to hide, and she was fully herself in the way that people become fully themselves when they've been fought for and fought with and stayed with through the years that ask something real. He thought, "I have never once in my life regretted moving that fence." He didn't say it. He didn't need to. They had been talking to each other for long enough that some things moved between them without words, which was a different thing from silence, and both of them knew it. The light finished going off the ridge. The valley went the blue-gray of a Montana October dusk, and the cattle were quiet, and the creek ran where it was always supposed to run, through common ground, belonging to no one and everyone at once. "You still owe me an apology," Tamsin said, "for the first Thursday, when you argued about the survey notation being ambiguous." "I've apologized for that," he said. "You said, and I quote, 'I may have been slightly mistaken about the eastern measurement.' That's an apology. That's a politician's apology." "Tamsin, I'm just saying it's still outstanding," she said, perfectly pleasantly. He looked at her. She was smiling, not looking at him, watching the valley. "You were right about the fence from the first day," he said. "Completely right. I was wrong, and I made you argue for it when you shouldn't have had to." She was quiet. "Is that sufficient?" he said. "It's a start," she said. "It's been 30 years. "Some things take time," she said. And she reached over without looking and took his hand, the way she had done for 30 years on this same south porch, in this same October light, and held it with the particular grip of someone who has no intention of letting go. The valley held the dark. The creek ran through it, clean and unobstructed as it always should have, and between them, not a single fence remained.